Well, hello, my name is Colin, and this is part 4 of Let's Learn Blender. In this video, we're going to dive head first into a little thing called 3D modeling. 3D modeling in Blender is the process of taking a three-dimensional mesh object, like the cube in the middle of our scene, and shaping it into whatever object that you want. A different 3D object, starting from usually a simpler 3D object, often a cube. So in this video, we're going to be looking at what's called edit mode of a mesh object in Blender, specifically the 3 different sub-object elements that make up every mesh object in your scene, which are vertices, edges, and faces. We're also going to be looking at many of the tools that you'll be using to make whatever 3D object you want, which include the Extrude Tool, as well as many of its variants, Subdivide, creating loop cuts, selecting both edge loops as well as edge rings, how to slide both edges as well as vertices along your mesh surface, the Bevel Tool, as well as the Offset Edge Loop Cut Tool, and finally, the Inset Faces tool. There are timecode links, by the way, down in the description area below in case you want to jump to any part of this video specifically. But if you're new to my channel, my name is Colin. Hello, I've been teaching Blender here on YouTube since 2011. I also teach how to use the Godot game engine on my channel as well, in case you're interested in checking that out. As always, if you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps out me and my channel, and it gets these videos more seen. If you want to see more videos like this one, go ahead and click on subscribe as well, and click that bell icon to be notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. So the process of 3D modeling in Blender starts with a quick discussion on modes. Whenever you select an object in Blender, like the camera, the light, or a mesh object like our 3D cube, there may or may not be different modes that you can go into for that kind of object. If we select our camera and then go up to this mode menu, we are in object mode, which basically means you can just select that whole object and use the transform tools to move it around and rotate it and scale it perhaps. But in the case of a mesh object, if we go up to this mode menu, there are many different modes that we can go into for that object. Now, if we're in a different mode that's not object mode for an object, it's going to be pretty tricky, if not impossible, to select another object while we're in the edit mode or a different mode of that object. So if I go into this mesh objects with it selected, it's edit mode. I now have access to, well, do editing, do 3D modeling, but while I'm in this object's edit mode, I can't select other objects until I go back into object mode. A quick way of jumping when you have a mesh selected between object mode and edit mode is the tab key on your keyboard. Pressing tab will jump you from object to edit mode and then back, if I press tab again, back into object mode. So if I press tab on my keyboard to go back into edit mode, you will see a few things change on my screen, primarily over here on the left side of my screen on what's called my toolbar. If I grab the edge of my toolbar and make it a little bit wider on my screen, you'll see I have a lot of different options here that I didn't have. I'll press tab while I was in object mode. In object mode, I can move and rotate and scale the mesh object as a whole, but while I'm in edit mode, I'll press tab. I get a lot of different tools, and we'll be talking about many of these in this video. The other thing you might notice is that I can now see the different corners called vertices of my mesh that are highlighted because I am in one of these 3 different selection modes for the 3 different sub-object elements of a mesh. In our case, vertices or vertex select mode, edge select mode, and face select mode. And yes, I can simply click on to select any vertex or multiple vertices if I hold shift or I draw a selection box to select them. And when I have a vertex or vertices, I often get those confused. I often say vertice instead of vertex. But if you have a vertex or vertices selected, you can tap G to move. You can tap S to scale. If you have multiple vertices selected, you cannot select one vertex and tap S because a vertex is just one coordinate in X, Y, Z coordinate space. If I have an edge selected in my 3D space, I can tap G to grab it and move it around and click. I can tap S to scale. I can tap R to rotate. And of course, I can use my transformation tools over in my toolbar as well. I can move, I can scale, I can rotate an edge. Of course, I can select multiple edges by holding shift. I could do whatever I want to those. I can also select faces, and that means I'm actually selecting the entire side of a cube or my mesh object. I'm able to scale and move and rotate with G, R, and S that face around. And of course, I can select multiple faces. So what I'm going to encourage you to do in this video is pause the video once in a while, try what I do. If you're brand new to Blender and 3D modeling, go ahead, pause the video, try going into your default cube's edit mode using the tab key or the menu, pull down menu, and see if you can select and transform vertices, edges, and faces. Go ahead, try that out. Have you tried it? One more thing you can do to switch between these three selection modes are the number row keys at the top of your keyboard. While you're in edit mode of a mesh, you can press 1, 2, and 3 to switch between vertex, edge, and face select modes. You can even hold shift and select all three and be in all three modes at once. I would not try this if you're an absolute beginner. It can be a little bit confusing. One thing I will point out is that if you transform your mesh in certain ways, if I grab a face on my mesh and I grab it, I'll use just my move tool and move it over, and I'll tap R and then Z to rotate on the Z axis. It is pretty easy to create what I believe is called a non-manifold 3D object. And what that means is that you are creating a 3D object that isn't proper. It's crashing through itself. It basically would not result in a realistic object with all the faces of the mesh facing in the correct direction, each face defining one surface. In other words, it wouldn't print into a very nice 3D model if you were to put this model into a 3D printing program and actually print it out using a 3D printer. It wouldn't turn out too well because I have faces intersecting one another, and I probably have some faces that really should be triangular faces with a proper edge running across them and not just folded it in half by Blender into some shape that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to go ahead and press Ctrl Z a few times to get this cube back to something more like a cube. But speaking of our cube is a great 3D object to start modeling any object you want from, because all the faces are the same size, they're all the same shape, they all have 4 sides, and the mesh is just really even, but we have a limitation with it. We have only 6 sides on our cube, just like a set of dice. Our cube only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 vertices, and it only has 12 edges. If we want to have more edges to do 3D modeling to make the shape that we want, we need to use some of the tools on our toolbar, as well as some tools that are in our right-click context menu, which is different, by the way. It has different items than if you're in the object mode. If I right-click, different options now. If I press tab, different options now. The first tool I want to talk about in this video is called the Extrude Tool. And Extrude works best when you're in face select mode, because what we're going to be doing is adding extensions or extrusions from the faces of our cube. So again, this works best while we're in face select mode, and I'm going to go down to this Extrude Region tool. If I select this tool, my mouse cursor now only can select faces because I'm in face select mode, but because I have this tool active, I have an extra gizmo on my screen. A gizmo is any on-screen control, including this little 3D axes gizmo over here, but this one happens to tell us that we can pull out, make an extension from a face on our cube. So if I click and drag it, you can see my cube now has an extension. Like if my cube was a house, my house now has a garage. You will notice that whenever I select a face and extrude it out by pulling on that little yellow plus handle, the extrusion goes directly away from, perpendicular from the face that we extruded out. And you will notice that if I grab a face that already has a wall next to it and I pull that face up, well, we now have a little bit of messy geometry, because if I now just use the move tool and move this face over, well, I have facing walls that were inside of the middle of my mesh. If I press Ctrl Z a few times to undo, and I use the Extrude tool again to go back up, if I want to just a 2 by 2 by 1 block, well, I don't exactly have that, do I? Because I have internal walls. I have internal geometry, and that's not ideal. I can actually see internal geometry a little bit easier on my screen. If I turn on this button right here, it's called X-ray mode. And with that mode enabled, I can see through my mesh to the other side. And when you're in face select mode, you will see dots or little squares on all of the faces. And if I orbit around, I can tell, hey, there's actually an extra wall. There's actually 2 extra walls, extra dots in the middle of the shape. It's not good. So I'm going to press Control Z a few times on my keyboard, and I'm going to redo this. I'll turn off X-ray mode just to make it a little bit easier on my screen. I'll select 2 faces next to one another, and I'll grab this little plus and I'll drag it up. And now that I've extruded both faces that were next to one another, I have 2 faces that are attached. And if I go into X-ray mode, there is no internal geometry that I don't want. I'm going to go ahead and back things up a little bit. I'll press Control Z once. One other thing you can do is once you start extruding, you can hold the Control key down on your keyboard, and that will let you extrude to increments in your 3D scene. If I hold Control as I extrude out, well, I'm extruding 1 meter at a time because my grid floor, my default unit is 1 meter. If I select 3 faces on the side, I'll turn off X-ray mode all at once. I'll hold Shift to get all 3. I'll hold Control. I'll extrude out twice. You can see if I want to create something like a chair, a simple 3D object, it wouldn't be too hard. I can continue this. I can select the corner faces. I'll hold Shift on my keyboard to do that, and I can extrude down. I'll orbit my scene and pan over and grab those 4 on the bottom and drag them down. And I'll grab 3 in a row on the top and I'll drag these up, and you can see I have a chair. And if I'm happy with my chair, I can go ahead and go back to object mode, and my chair is done, and I can go and work with other objects, or I could scale my chair down to be a more realistic size. There are a few different versions of the Extrude tool as well. If I click on the button for the Extrude tool on my toolbar and hold as I click, you'll see different versions available to you here. One reason for this is if I go into a face select mode and I select 2 faces on different sides and I extrude them both out at the same time, you can see that they extrude out not in their own direction, but along an average of their 2 directions. So because one face is facing up and the other is facing to the left or on the y-axis, well, it kind of blends the direction together and chooses an average direction to go out. If I don't want that, I'll press Control Z on my keyboard. I could switch over to, well, extrude individual mode, which will extrude each face individually. Or I'll press Control Z. I could go and select extrude along normals. This is a variation of the tool which will extrude more correctly. It went straight up and straight out, but the resulting faces aren't even. But remember that on your bottom left of your 3D editor window, you have a panel with your most recent operation. If I open the section up and I choose offset even, it should fix that problem. There is a newer version of this tool. It's an option called Extrude Manifold, and this fixes a problem that Blender had for a long time, where if you wanted to extrude inward, you would sometimes find that Blender wouldn't know how to cut a hole in a surface without leaving very thin, in fact, impossibly thin surfaces where you didn't want them to be. I'll show you what I mean here. If I don't use Extrude Manifold, if I just say Extrude Region, and I extrude this face inwards, you can see that, well, I probably just wanted Blender to cut a corner out of this object, but it left me with a set of faces. I'll go back to the selection tool here, one that's here, and one that's on the outside as well, because those 2 faces overlap perfectly. Blender didn't deal with that very well. If I press Control Z a few times to undo that inward extrusion, and I go back to the Extrude tool, but I this time choose Extrude Manifold, and I do the same operation with this new tool, you can see that that problem is fixed. So if you ever run into that problem where you have some faces that are thin because the extrude didn't work the way it should, this tool might solve that problem. The last version of this tool is called the Extrude to Cursor tool, and this one's more just a little bit of fun for us. If I use this tool, the Extrude to Cursor tool, I can no longer just click to select a face. If I click in my 3D viewport, it will extrude whatever I have to wherever I click. So if I click, you can see I had a face selected there. It extruded to wherever I clicked, and it picked a kind of an average direction to go to. If I zoom out and I keep clicking, and in fact, if I orbit my view, I can make it work in 3D as well. you'll see what's happening. It's extruding to wherever I click. If I want to select a different face to start from, I believe I can hold Control on my keyboard and click on a face. Control will actually select all the faces between. I could press Alt-A. Alt-A will deselect everything in my scene. And now if I hold Control and click on a face, it'll just select that face. And now if I do a click anywhere in my viewport, I can do my click to cursor. There we go. Now in Blender, there are these versions of these common edit mode tools in our toolbar, but you should also know that there are legacy versions of these tools available to you using keyboard shortcuts. If I select a face on my 3D mesh, I'll select the top face here. By the way, please make sure that when you use the Extrude tool that you don't still have all of the faces on your cube selected. That would try to extrude them all outwards in some weird way. I'll select just one face to start with. Now, if I press the letter E on my keyboard, E for extrude, well, it's extruded without me having to even use that tool on my toolbar, and I could just move my mouse outward and click. So even if you don't want to switch away from the selection tool and you just select a face in edit mode, you can tap E on your keyboard, move your mouse and click. Just make sure that when you tap E and then move your mouse, that you actually do move your mouse, because if you don't and then click, well, now I have an extra, I'll tap G, I have an extra extrusion right here that wasn't actually extruded. That's actually easy to do by mistake. If you tap E and then you right click instead of left click, it'll snap back. But know that now I have basically double, or in my case, triple edges here, which is messy geometry. I want to avoid that. So the letter E is great to extrude, but if you want to try extruding using one of those other tools, but use the old E keyboard shortcut, you can also press Alt-E. If I have different faces selected on different sides and I don't want to do extrude them as a region, let's say I want to extrude them as individual faces or along their normals. By the way, a normal is the direction that usually a face is facing. So the normal of this top face is straight up on the Z-axis, and this face's normal is pointing in the positive X direction. I can see that over here at the X points in the positive direction. If I select two faces and I press Alt-E on my keyboard, Alt-E brings up the extrude menu, and I can say extrude individual faces, and then I can move my mouse up or down in this case, and I can click, and there we go. In edit mode, there's also a tool called the Subdivide Tool, but unfortunately, this is not a tool that's available in our toolbar. You have to select something in your mesh, either a face or an edge. So I'll select the top face on my cube in edit mode, and then you right click. And under the right click context menu, the very first option here, again, I don't know why it's not one of these tools. That's an active tool that you can change your mouse into doing that action. I don't know why it's not there, but if you right click when you have a face or an edge selected, Subdivide will take that 3D primitive sub-object element, and it'll cut that element in any direction where that object exists. So if I select Subdivide, it'll take this face and cut it in both the X and Y directions, creating 4 faces out of just one, because this face exists on the X and Y axes, it faces up. Now that I have these 4 faces, I can do 3D modeling with the higher level of geometry that I have on this mesh. I could select each one of these faces on the side of my cube and I can extrude them out, and that could be the shape that I want. So subdividing is just a way of getting more geometry, more edges and more faces into the same area on your mesh. I'll go ahead and press Ctrl Z on my keyboard a few times to undo that, because sometimes you might want to just select edges and subdivide them as well. If I select this edge, I'm now in edge select mode, and this edge, I'll hold Shift to select the second one there, and I right click and say subdivide. Well, it's taken both of these edges and subdivided them, but because edges are two-dimensional, they only go in, one direction at a time, it's simply taken that edge and cut it in two, and it cut both edges into 2 equal edges, and it actually drew, in this case, an edge between those edges, so now I could make, well, if I grab my move tool, a little house. Now, this brings me to my next point, where I need to point out that in edit mode of a mesh, you typically have faces on a mesh that are made of either 3 sides, like a triangular face, or a quad, which is a face with 4 sides. In this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, edges on the side of this quad or rectangular face. But now that I did a subdivision across the top of my cube, I now have what's called an N-Gon. And an N-Gon is a face, a polygon with an unknown number of edges along the side, more than 3 or 4. This face right here, if I select it, has more than 4 or 3 sides now. If I select each side, 1, 2, or edge, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, N-Gons are okay sometimes, but ideally you try to avoid them. N-Gons can cause problems with future tools we'll talk about in this video. N-Gons can also cause problems when you're trying to smooth out an object or animate an object. N-Gons are just not a very nice way of maintaining a nice topology on your mesh. The topology of a mesh is the organization and flow of edges and faces and surfaces along the shape or around the shape of your 3D object. N-Gons can be divided up into quads or tris. Typically, quads are ideal, especially if you want the edges of your mesh to run nicely. I'll turn on X-ray mode, nicely around your mesh in loops of edges called edge loops. So keep in mind that N-Gons, what we have now, is not totally ideal. Something else I can do in edit mode with the Subdivide tool is I'll go ahead in edit mode of my default cube and I'll press A on my keyboard. A selects all of your current selectable sub-objects, in this case my faces, and I'm going to, with all faces selected, I will right click and say subdivide. When you subdivide all the faces on a cube, it cuts every face in 2 directions. Therefore, I have a 2 by 2 by 2 cube. Now, of course, I can change the options of what I just did in this little popover on the bottom left of my screen. I can even change the number of cuts to 2, making basically a Rubik's Cube. And of course, you can make more if you want. You might think that if you want to make a very detailed mesh, that you might want to start turning up the number of subdivisions on your mesh to a really high number to start modeling. That's not what you want to do. You want to start with a few number of faces, get the shape that you want, and then add more detail as you go. In this case, if I want to make a sphere out of my cube, the Subdivide tool has a smoothing option that I think is worth you seeing right now. If I turn the number of cuts down here to 2 by 2 by 2, and then I change the smoothness up to 1, it slides from 0 to 1, you can see that now I basically have turned my cube into a sphere. And from this sphere, I could start modeling something like a character's head or any object that's maybe a little bit rounded. And this object is probably better to use than just a default UV sphere, because I'll go ahead and press tab to go back into object mode. If I add a mesh UV sphere, you will notice on the top of the UV sphere, I'll zoom into it, and yes, I can press tab to go into edit mode of the UV sphere. You will notice that it has a bunch of tight edges running together at the top and on the bottom, which form triangular faces, which get really hard to work with when they're so tightly packed together in one little area. So the topology on this sphere that I just created using a cube is probably more manageable and easy to work with than the default UV sphere. Next up is the Loop Cut tool. This is a tool again on our toolbar. It is this one right here. When you are in edit mode and you want to make a cut around the surface of your 3D mesh object, this is the tool for you. When you make a cut, that is essentially making a set of edges that run around the surface of your mesh that will help you add more detail into your existing mesh shape. So all I have to do to use this tool is select the Loop Cut tool, and then I can just click on my mesh. And now I have an extra edge all the way around this mesh. And if I'm happy with that, I can just go into edge select mode. I can grab that top edge and I can use my move tool and I can move it up. And now I have a little house without any N-Gons, because this face and this face both have 4 sides, as do the faces on the bottom and the back as well. Now, if I don't want to place a loop cut directly in the middle of a section, so if I go ahead and use the Loop Cut tool, if I just click with the Loop Cut tool, it places an edge right in the middle of whatever edge that you hover your mouse over and around the rest of the mesh. But I'll go ahead and press Ctrl Z on my keyboard to undo that. If I click and drag and then I let go, I can place that edge wherever I want. So if I want to make a little chimney on this house, I might drag an edge. I'll press Control Z. I'll drag my edge loop that I'm making right now to right about there. I'll drag another one right there. Maybe I'll put a edge loop right there and one right there. And then I can use that Extrude tool that we talked about a few moments ago right there. I'll select in face select mode this face. And while I'm extruding this time, I could, once I start dragging up, I'll just tap Z on my keyboard. In fact, I'll tap it twice and it'll move straight up now, not along the normal, not in the normal direction of the origin face of that extrusion, but up on the Z direction of our global world. So now I have a little bit of a chimney. What I could do at this point is I could scale this face to 0 on the Z axis. So if I tap S on my keyboard to scale that face, but then I tap Z on my keyboard to scale it up and down only, and then I tap 0 on my keyboard, that'll scale it to 0 on my Z axis, and now I can press Enter on my keyboard. So now I have a top flat chimney surface for my house. Now, something else I can do with the Loop Cut tool is I can make more than one cut at a time. If I click and drag to make a cut, and I'm happy with that one, but I realize after I make the cut that I want this cut to actually be 2 set of edge loops running one next to another, I can go down to my loop cut options and I can change the number of cuts here up to 2, or I can even drag in there to make as many as I want. Of course, that's going a little bit crazy, 2 or 3 might be something that is more manageable. You can also, before you make a loop cut at all, if you're using the loop cut tool, you can change the number of cuts up here on your tool options bar, or over in your properties editor, you can go to the first tab, which is actually all of the options. Some of them only might show up at the top, but they'll all be over here. I can change it over here as well. So if I have 3 over here, there'll be 3 up here as well. Now, if I click, I've just made 3. Of course, I can click and drag to place the 3 wherever I want as well. Now, as with pretty much anything in Blender, there's a keyboard shortcut for pretty much everything. If you don't want to use this newer active version of the Loop Cut tool in Blender, you can stick to just your basic transform tools or your select tools, but you can access the Loop Cut and slide version of this tool using a keyboard shortcut. It is Control R. Control R on your keyboard when you're in edit mode will let you make a loop cut. So Control R there on my keyboard lets me place a loop, and of course I can move my mouse around the surface of my mesh object to choose where it goes. And this time, if I click, it has not yet fully finished making that loop cut because it wants me to slide the edge around and choose where it goes, and then I can just click to place it in its final location where it will actually make the edges around my mesh. So this one requires, I'll press Control Z, an extra few clicks, Control R on your keyboard, click, and then click to place it wherever you want. You can have multiple edge loops at once. If you can press Control R, you can scroll up on your mouse wheel to make more cuts, and then click and then click. If you want to put the loop cut directly in the middle of the edges that you're placing it on, it's pretty easy. You just click and then you right click instead of click to place. So again, Control R, click. You can slide around and click, but if you want to put it right in the middle exactly, you can right click at that point, okay? Speaking of creating edge loops, there might be some point in your Blender future where you realize that you want to select all of the edges around a mesh that connect together end to end, like this one to this one to this one to this one, but all the way around your mesh. And this mesh isn't too bad. It's just a pretty almost default cube. So there's about, 12 or 16 edges to select, and it wouldn't take me too much time holding Shift to select all of these, but there's a quicker way. If you simply, I'll press Alt-A on my keyboard to deselect all, Alt-A deselects everything. If I hold Alt on my keyboard and then I click on an edge, Alt clicking on an edge will select what's called an edge loop. To remember what an edge loop is, think about a loop of string tied around your finger to remind you of something perhaps. A loop of edges, an edge loop, is basically that. It's connected edges end to end, usually around a mesh. Now, there is also something called an edge ring, and an edge ring is like, well, think about a ring on your finger. If you have a loop of string, it's quite narrow, it's quite thin wrapping around your finger, but a ring, like a gold ring, would be wider. And so a ring of edges, an edge ring, would be this edge and this edge and this edge. They are perpendicular edges that run around a mesh. So well, here's how you select it. If I press Alt-A to deselect all, and I hold Control and Alt on my keyboard, Control and Alt, and click on an edge, it will select all of the perpendicular edges around that mesh, and that might be handy for you in the future. So if you want to pause the video, Alt, click, selects an edge loop, Control Alt, click, selects an edge ring. Next up, edge slide and vertex slide. For this example, it makes more sense for me to show you what this looks like on a UV sphere, which is a rounded object. I'm going to go ahead and press Tab to go into edit mode of my UV sphere. When you want to take an edge or even an edge loop and slide it along the surface of your mesh without changing the overall shape as much as possible of that mesh, edge slide as well as vertex slide is what you want to be doing. If I go ahead in edge select mode and I hold Alt on my keyboard and select an edge loop all the way around my UV sphere, if I wanted to take this, let's say, line of longitude or line of latitude, I can't quite recall from a geography class. If I wanted to move this edge loop, if this was the Earth, up or down, but along the surface of the mesh, well, of course, I could use the Move tool, but if I move this edge loop up or down, well, on the Z-axis, I'm changing the shape. I'm making the globe, in this case, not very round anymore. I could, of course, move this edge maybe down, and then I could tap the S key on my keyboard to scale it out, and I could, kind of eyeball it. Maybe I could go to my front view and see where it should go, but there is an easier way. I'll press Ctrl-Z on my keyboard a few times to get back to the default. If I simply go on my toolbar to this tool, it's called Edge Slide, and I select it, now I get an on-screen control gizmo, and I can simply slide the edge around. Now you can see maybe it's slightly deforming, the shape does change a little bit, but I am doing the best that I can with the geometry that I can. It's simply sliding that edge loop along that overall edge without changing the overall shape as much as possible. I don't have to do this, by the way, with a whole edge loop. If I just select one edge, I can do the same thing, and that is a better result than just using the Move tool, and moving it up, or even using the right axes and doing something like this, and you see you don't get the result that you want. The Edge Slide tool is invaluable when you want to just adjust things in the topology of your mesh without changing the shape as much as possible. There is a version of this tool for vertices as well. It's called Vertex Slide. It's a sub option of the Vertex or Edge Slide tool. Vertex Slide, if I simply go into Vertex select mode and select a vertice, I can now, using this on-screen circular gizmo, slide that vertice in any edge that connects directly to that vertice, so, to the right, left, up, or down, but it will try to minimize the amount that you're changing the overall shape of your mesh. So that's good. There is, of course, keyboard shortcuts versions for both of those. If I go into edge select mode, and maybe I'll hold Alt and click on an edge to select that whole edge loop, if I simply tap G twice, so GG on my keyboard, and then move my mouse, I am now sliding that loop of edges, and I can click to place that edge loop wherever I want. Of course, I'll press Ctrl-Z, I can slide that edge, I'll tap GG and move it up or down, that works as well. And if I'm in vertice select mode or vertex select mode and I select one vertex, of course I can press GG as well, and that gets me into vertex slide quite easily. Next up is the Bevel Tool. In Blender, if you want to take an edge, let's say you want to take this edge on a cube and slice it off. So you kind of have a diagonal chamfered edge on an object like this. You can do that using what's called the Bevel Tool. In Blender, if I select an edge and I go over to this Bevel Tool, you can see what it looks like. I get a gizmo on that selected edge, and I can simply drag it out. And hey, it split that edge into two, creating a new diagonal face, and I could leave it, well, like that. Now, if I want that beveled edge to be rounded, I can just go down to my options, the ones that appear down here in the popover, and I can open that up, and I can say, hey, I want to increase the number of segments from one, so not just one diagonal face, but I can turn that up, and as you can see when you do, you get a rounded edge. Now, you have to be careful here because when you bevel an edge, you've suddenly made, well, 2 or more N-Gons. This is now a face that has many, many more sides than just 3 or 4 because each one of, these edges is a separate edge along the radius of that new circle, basically, that we have at that corner. So if I try to do, let's say, a loop cut, and this is one of the tools that gets interrupted by N-Gons, a loop cut, if I press Control R on my keyboard, and you can see I move my mouse cursor around, or if I use the loop cut tool here on my toolbar, you can see the loop cut can go in some directions, but N-Gons interrupt it. I've got 3 cuts on my loop cut there. So N-Gons are something that you might want to avoid, and the Bevel tool will create N-Gons, so be aware of that. Also be aware that if you bevel one edge, and then later on you decide that you want to, I'll go back to my Bevel tool, and then you decide that you want to bevel a neighboring edge like this one, well, it's not going to work too well because you can't overwrite the edges that you've already created to make the other side of this cube rounded in the other direction. So I would need to go back in this case, Control Z many times, and select edges that were all next to one another. In fact, I could even select a whole face and bevel all of the edges around that face by dragging on it with the Bevel tool. And of course, I could change the width. I could change the shape. If it has more than one segment, I can change the shape of it to whatever kind of outward or inward that I want. And so I could have a rounded cube. But the Bevel tool can be used for more than just rounding and chamfering the edges of meshes. We can also take, with the Bevel tool, one edge and split it into 2, even if it's not on the corner of a mesh. If I go ahead and press Control R, or I'll use the loop cut tool here and I click, in fact, I'll change the number of cuts to just 1 for this. And then I take that single edge loop. In fact, I'll deselect it. I'll press Alt A, and then I'll reselect it using Alt and then click to select that whole edge loop. If I want to take this edge loop later on in my process of modeling and split it into 2, let's say I want to take the middle of this top of this box and extrude it upwards, well, I would need to have a face in the middle of the top of the box to extrude upwards. So I could take this edge loop and I could bevel it. I'll grab my Bevel tool and just drag out, and you can see it splits that one edge into 2. And now I can take a face there. I'll minimize that pop over there. And I can take my Extrude tool now. I'll just grab one face. I'll select that top face. And now I'll use my Extrude tool and extrude up. And that's my goal. Now, you should also be aware that with the Bevel tool, you can not only bevel edges and faces like I've already done in this video, you can also bevel vertices. If I go over to the Bevel tool and then go into Vertex Select mode, and I select a vertex on the corner, which will probably work better for this example, of a mesh, if you pull on the gizmo handle of the Bevel tool, well, by default, nothing will happen because the Bevel tool really has 2 modes. Edges mode and vertices mode, and this is called the effect mode. If I'm in edges mode, well, it won't bevel a vertex, but if I switch over to vertices effect mode, you can see kind of what happened. If I press Control Z on my keyboard, and I actually change it up here on my toolbar, the effect mode from edges to vertices, and then I go ahead and use that handle, you can see what happens. Basically, when you bevel a vertex, it chops off the corner if that vertex is on a corner. Of course, you can change the settings under the popover on the bottom left. You can change the number of segments to make it rounded. You can change the width. You can change the shape if you have more than one segment turned on, so you can make it kind of concave. That's kind of interesting. So if I want to have a cube with rounded corners, well, here's a default cube in edit mode, in vertex select mode. If I press A on my keyboard to select all the vertices, and then I use the Bevel tool and make sure I've changed the effect mode to vertices, I could just pull up from the middle, and then I could change the bevel segments up, and there we go. I have basically a rounded corner cube. Now, of course, there is a keyboard shortcut for the Bevel tool as well. If I go ahead and select an edge on my default cube and I press Control B. Control B is the Bevel tool. I can move my mouse and I get the bevel. Now, because I had already set my number of segments to be higher, I got that. But of course, I can change my segments down to 1 or any number that I want. Control B is bevel. One of the nice things you can do while you're using Control B, if I press Control B and then scroll on my mouse wheel, I get a rounded corner, which is kind of nice. I can also bevel vertices using a keyboard shortcut. It's a little bit different. If I select a vertex and I press Control Shift B on my keyboard, Control Shift B, and move my mouse out, I can bevel a vertice. So Control B and Control Shift B. And then of course, once I've started beveling, I can use the recent operators pop over and change the number of segments and the shape and the width to my heart's content. The next tool is called the Offset Edge Loop Cut tool, and while that's a mouthful to say, this tool is a lot like the Bevel tool when you use the Bevel tool to split an edge loop around a mesh into multiple edge loops. If I go ahead and under the Loop Cut tool, there is this Offset Edge Loop Cut tool. Before I use that though, I'm going to actually just press Control R on my keyboard and make a loop cut and use the loop cut and slide with Control R, of course, and I'll click and then I'll click again to place a loop around there. If I press Alt A on my keyboard, I can deselect that edge loop, and then I can hold Alt and click on an edge in edge select mode to select that whole edge loop. If I want to split this edge loop into multiple loops, of course I could use the Bevel tool, but also that's what this tool is really for. If I use it and then I click on an edge loop or just an edge, perhaps I can split that edge into two. It won't work in one direction in this case, but it'll work in the other direction, and you can see what's happening. It's taken that one edge and it's made two more edges on either side. Now in this case, it's actually moving the edges proportionally, so it's actually moving the edge loop on the right, not as far as the one on the left away from it, because again, it's moving proportionally a percentage of this overall distance on either side, this distance versus this distance here. If I go ahead and try that again, I'll press Control Z a few times to undo that. If I go ahead and grab the Offset Edge Loop Cut tool and drag away, let's go ahead and see what the recent operator options are. If I turn on even, you can see maybe that makes the distance away from that edge even. So there you go. The keyboard shortcut for this, by the way, is I'll undo that, Control Shift R on my keyboard, Control Shift R, then I can move my mouse and that will split that edge loop into two, keeping the original edge loop there, of course, as this tool does. Last up is the Inset Faces tool. If you use the Inset Faces tool, which is right here, what you are doing with the tool is you are making a smaller face inside of a larger face. Now, there's actually many ways you can do this, but this tool allows you to do it quicker. You can press, of course, let's say Control R, or use the Loop Cut tool to, let's say, make a cut, or actually a couple of cuts. Well, I'll just show you. I'll click, and then I'll place my two cuts. I'll change the number of cuts down here to 2, and then I could make the same 2 cuts right there, and I'll change that to 2. And then if I wanted to take this smaller face in the middle, I'll grab my select tool and I'll grab this middle face. That's a middle face inside of a larger face, the top of the cube. And then I could, let's say, if this was going to be a very blocky cup or the top of a chimney, I could extrude with the E key or the Extrude Tool, the face in the middle downwards. Of course, I could achieve this same result, at least as you would see it in object mode, using the Extrude Tool as well. I'll press Control Z a few times to get rid of those extra edges. If I simply select the top face of my cube and I tap E to extrude, or I use the Extrude Tool right there, but instead of extruding upwards, if I just tapped E and then I right-clicked to snap that extrusion, which is still there, but I snapped it down just by right-clicking, and then I tap S on my keyboard, that would scale that new extrusion to make it smaller. You know, it would be like that, but flat with the top of my cube. And then I could make, with the S key, I could scale it to whatever size that I want, and then I could tap E to extrude downwards. This gives you a different topology. I've got edges coming from the corners of the top of my cube instead of going all the way around. There are pros and cons to both of those ways, but this second method, using extrude and then, scale and then making sure it's flat on the top and not going up or down, there's a quicker way. If I press Control-Z and Control-Z a few times to undo, if I use the Inset Faces tool, that's exactly what this does. If I simply grab a face and make it smaller, you can see it does all that work for me. Now, it does not have to be a flat surface on the top. I have options down here. I can change the thickness. That means the size of the borders around the inset or smaller face. I can change the depth, which means how much I'm going up or down or extruding, or I guess intruding is the opposite of extrude. And, you know, there we go. Now, things get a little bit more tricky for us if we didn't have this Inset Faces tool. If I wanted to inset around a corner, which sounds pretty easy, but I'll show you what I mean. If I undo that and I try to do the same thing, I will select the selection tool here, and I'll grab, you know, these two faces using the Shift key. And then if I want to, you know, make an extrusion going out from the top of the cube and from the side of the cube here, but flowing nicely, you can see what my problem is going to be here. If I tap E on my keyboard to extrude out, you know, it makes an extrusion, but I'm going to go ahead and right click to snap that extrusion back into place. And so now if I tap S on my keyboard, you know, I can make the surface of where I want to extrude from, but you can see it's gone in towards the middle of the cube. So I can move it straight up and then straight out. This is quite a bit of work. And you can see that, you know, I have the surface that I want to extrude from, but it's not even. This is thicker than this going across, and this is taller than these two sides are wide. So it's not ideal. And then I could go Alt-E on my keyboard, and I could say extrude faces along normals. And then I could do something like that and say offset even, and that would fix it. There's an easier way. The Inset Faces tool, if I Control-Z a few times, fixes this problem for us. I'll just make sure I've gone back to my original mesh. If I use Inset Faces around a corner, so I've selected these two faces, and I inset around a corner, you can see it's all nice and even around. And then I could simply Alt-E, extrude faces along normals, and I can go out and say offset even. So getting this inset around the side of my cube was made a lot easier with the Inset Faces tool. You need to be careful though, because if you have scaled your mesh at all in the process of modeling whatever you're trying to create, in this case, I'm going to press Tab to go back into my default cube's object mode. And then if I use the scale tool and stretch out the cube, and then I go back into edit mode, I'll press Tab to do that, and I go and select, let's say, the top face. If I use Inset Faces now, if I tap I on my keyboard and move my mouse inward, and by the way, I is the keyboard shortcut for Inset Faces, you can see that it did not inset evenly, even though it really should have. All four of these outside faces should be the same width. They're not. And that's because a mesh insets proportionally based on the size that it thinks it is. Now, every mesh knows that it has a default size, and it just assumes when you use any of those tools like Extrude or Inset Faces or Bevel, especially Bevel and Inset Faces, that your mesh is the size and proportions that it should be. If I go ahead and press N, the letter N on my keyboard with my mouse in the 3D editor window, I can look at the item that I have selected. I can look at its scale. And if it's not set to 1, 1, and 1, we have a problem because the mesh knows that it's being stretched. So I need to change all of these to 1 by going up to, with the mesh selected, Object, Apply, and then Rotation and Scale. In this case, I could just apply the scale, but Rotation and Scale is one that I just go to out of habit. So Rotation and Scale, and now the scale is all at 1s, which is what I need. Again, that's Object, Apply, Rotation, and Scale, or just Scale there. Now that I've done that, I can go ahead and press the letter N to hide that side properties panel. I can press Tab to go back into edit mode. And now if I select, let's say, this face, and I tap I on my keyboard, or I use the active tool here, you can see that all of the edges are even. This problem with the scale being stretched, not 1, 1, 1, will also affect you if you're trying to bevel. If I grab, let's say this edge on the bottom and I bevel it, Control B, you can see if I scroll down just one face that it's beveling at a nice 45-degree angle. But if I undo that, Control Z, go back into object mode with the tab key, and then I scale that mesh out on the y-axis and press tab and bevel again. Oh, you know what? I've got the Inset Faces tool selected. I'll use the Bevel tool instead. And if I bevel that edge, you can see the top edge is sliding a lot faster and I'm not getting a nice 45-degree angle here. That's a problem, and that's caused by the stretching of my overall mesh. If I press Control Z, go back into object mode, object, apply, scale this time, and then I go back into edit mode with the tab key. I'm using the Bevel tool this time. I'll drag my little gizmo, and now I'm beveling at a 45-degree angle. And if I Control B to bevel and I scroll up and down, I'll get a nice rounded edge and not a stretched kind of an oval edge, which I probably wouldn't want. So this has been an introduction to 3D modeling in Blender using Blender's edit mode. We've talked about how to get into and out of edit mode to access a mesh object's faces, edges, and vertices. We've talked about tools, including the Extrude Tool, the Subdivide Tool, Loop Cut Tool, the Bevel Tool, and Offset Edge Loop Cut Tool. If you want to try your hand at a fairly simple project that puts together all of these tools, I'll include a link to a previous video I made on the introduction to edit mode using Blender 2.8 a year or two ago. In the last part of that video, about the second half of it or so, I walk you through how to create a somewhat detailed house, including a garage and a roof and different sections of a roof and a little breakfast nook at one end. If you're interested in practicing all of these tools, putting them together to create a somewhat detailed but still fairly low poly count mesh object, I'll put a link to that point in that older video in the description area below. It'll be right at the top of the description right below this video on YouTube. But that will be it for this video. As always, my name is Colin. Thanks so much for watching this video. Please go ahead and click that like, subscribe, and bell icon below. It really helps out me and my channel and gets these videos seen. Check out my Facebook page and my Instagram page. In those two places, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next, and it's where I communicate with you, my viewers, the most outside of here on YouTube. But that'll be it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.